You've certainly heard the name Cleopatra, but what do you really know about her? This isn't just the story of an Egyptian queen. It's a drama of power, love, betrayal, and the struggle for independence. In this video, you'll learn how Cleopatra, still very young, became entangled in the fight for the throne, and how she managed to forge an alliance with Julius Caesar himself. We'll recount how her personal relationships with Rome's two most influential men, Caesar and Mark Antony, transformed into political weapons. You'll discover why Rome feared Cleopatra, how her alliance with Antony became a threat to the entire Mediterranean, and how this deadly game ended. And of course, we'll examine the most famous scene of her life. Did Cleopatra truly die from a snake bite, or was it completely different? Suggest topics for new videos in the comments and subscribe to the channel. Sleep stories are published here every day. Cleopatra's story begins long before her name became a symbol of power, diplomatic genius, and tragic destiny. She was born into a world ruled for centuries by the Ptolemaic dynasty, descendants of Ptolemy the Soter, one of Alexander the Great's closest companions. After the great conqueror's death, Ptolemy received Egypt as his domain and founded his own dynasty there. The Ptolemaic dynasty was Hellenistic in origin, but ruled Egypt by adapting many local traditions. The Ptolemies preserved Egyptian rites, adopted the titles of pharaohs, built temples to the gods of the Nile Valley, and participated in religious ceremonies. Yet they lived court life according to Greek canons, spoke Greek, and patronized science, philosophy, literature, and art. Their capital, Alexandria, became the largest intellectual and cultural center of the Mediterranean, home to the famous Library of Alexandria and one of the seven wonders of the world, the lighthouse on the island of Pharos. Cleopatra 7. Philopator was born in 69 BC. She was the daughter of Ptolemy the Phoenician, Neos Dionysos, nicknamed Olitz, which translates from Greek as the flute player. The nickname reflected either his passion for music or, according to mocking contemporaries, his tendency to neglect state affairs for pleasure, though it's more accurate to say he was a ruler caught between the millstones of immense international interests. Her mother's name is not preserved in the sources. Most likely she came from a family of concubines or priestesses, possibly of Egyptian descent. However, there is no precise confirmation of this. In any case, Cleopatra grew up in a culture where Hellenic and Egyptian traditions were tightly interwoven, making her a unique figure among the rulers of her dynasty. Ptolemy the Routine had 6 children, 2 older sisters, Berenice IV and Cleopatra Syrinx Tryphena, a younger sister, Arsinoe IV, and 2 younger brothers, Ptolemy the Thorn and Ptolemy the Stointhrum. Each would become either her ally or rival at different times, with some becoming outright enemies threatening her life. Cleopatra's childhood unfolded in the palace at Alexandria, a vast and luxurious palace complex near the royal harbor. From its windows, one could see the Pharos lighthouse, whose lights illuminated the bay, and the endless rows of ship masts arriving with goods from across the Mediterranean and the East. Inside the palace were marble halls, colonnades, fountains, and inner gardens filled with the scent of orange and pomegranate trees. But behind this external beauty lay a constant whirlpool of court intrigues, conspiracies, and dangers. From an early age, Cleopatra received a brilliant Hellenistic education. Court tutors taught her grammar, rhetoric, mathematics, geometry, astronomy, philosophy, medicine, and diplomacy. Special attention was paid to languages. She mastered Greek perfectly, spoke Egyptian fluently, a rarity for her dynasty, and also knew Latin, Aramaic, Syriac, Ethiopian, and, by some accounts, several other Eastern languages. Mastering Egyptian wasn't merely a formality, it was a deliberate political choice. Cleopatra understood that to rule Egypt effectively, she must speak to her subjects in their language, address priests, the people, merchants, and officials directly, not through translators as her predecessors had done. Sources emphasize that Cleopatra stood out from an early age not for her appearance, but for her intellect, quick wit, charm, and ability to win people over. Her voice was described as soft, melodious, and captivating. She learned early to listen, analyze, and quickly grasp the essence of situations, Even in youth, she was often invited to attend discussions with advisors, priests, and foreign ambassadors. The political environment in which Cleopatra grew up was extremely unstable. Her father, Ptolemy XIII, found himself in a difficult position. Egypt formally retained independence, but had long been dependent on the Roman Republic, which interfered in its affairs and dictated terms. To remain on the throne, Ptolemy was forced to pay Rome enormous sums, mortgage Egyptian territories, and take colossal loans from Roman bankers, primarily from the Crassus family. The people disliked him for his excessive concessions to the Romans and the crushing taxes that fell on ordinary Egyptians. Unrest began in Alexandria, escalating into open rebellion. While Ptolemy hastily went to Rome to seek help, his eldest daughter Berenice seized power in Egypt. She was crowned queen and became the formal ruler of Egypt, entering into marriage to strengthen her position. Cleopatra was still very young at this time, but understood perfectly well how the struggle for power within the family could end. Her father's years in exile became an important life lesson. She observed how her father, finding himself in Rome, spent a fortune bribing senators, promising political patronage, and paying mercenary armies to regain his crown. In 55 BC, Ptolemy, supported by Roman troops provided by Aulus Gabinius, the proconsul of Syria, returned to Egypt. The revolt was brutally suppressed. Berenice, despite being his own daughter, was executed, and her supporters faced mass reprisals. After this, Cleopatra drew even closer to her father. She actively participated in court affairs, accompanied him to religious ceremonies, attended negotiations with priests and officials, observed the tax collection system, provincial administration, finances, and the army. Her father increasingly entrusted her with various assignments. By this time, Cleopatra clearly understood that Egypt had become a pawn in Rome's hands. The country's position balanced between formal independence and actual subordination to the interests of the mighty republic. She observed how some pharaohs became puppets of the Senate, while others tried to resist and paid with their lives. The death of Ptolemy XIII in 51 BC marked the beginning of a new chapter in the struggle for the throne between Cleopatra and her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, who was only 10 years old at the time. Their father's will formally appointed them co-rulers, but real power now depended not on words in a document, but on the ability to survive, negotiate, outwit, or defeat rivals. The death of Ptolemy XIII marked the end of an entire era, an era of unstable yet maintained equilibrium between Rome, internal opponents, and dynastic intrigues. With his passing, Egypt found itself not merely in uncertainty, but in a rapidly escalating crisis where the state's fate depended on who proved more capable of holding the throne in this endless power struggle. According to the will, the throne passed simultaneously to his daughter and his youngest son, Ptolemy. At the time of their father's death, Cleopatra was 18, while her brother was only 10. This union seemed quite familiar for the Ptolemaic dynasty, where the practice of co-rule between brother and sister was combined with formal dynastic marriages intended to strengthen power and ensure succession. The will, sealed by the signatures and seals of Roman consuls, had not only internal legal force, but also the status of an international document, as Egypt's fate had long been inseparable from Rome's interests. Formally, the new power structure was established quickly. Coins began to be minted bearing the image of the young Ptolemy in the royal diadem with traditional pharaonic attributes. Cleopatra's name also appeared alongside, emphasizing her equal status. All official documents began with the formula, King Ptolemy and Queen Cleopatra, the sibling gods. However, beneath this facade of unity lay a slowly but steadily growing schism. A group of guardians and regents quickly formed around the young king, effectively controlling the administration in his name. The chief role among them was played by the eunuch Pothinus, Ptolemy's tutor, an extremely ambitious and cruel man. Alongside him stood the army commander Achilles, a military leader with real power, and the rhetorician Theodotus of Chios, a talented but cynical advisor who understood well that the collapse of formalities was usually followed by knives. These men quickly realized Cleopatra was far from a convenient figure they could keep in the shadows under the guise of a formal co-ruler. She immediately showed she intended to rule Egypt seriously. Already in her first year of rule, Decrees began to be issued in Egypt signed solely by her name, without mention of Ptolemy. Her own name began to be minted on coins, a rare occurrence in the dynasty's history where male primacy and power was always emphasized. Cleopatra confidently took control of foreign and domestic policy. She handled finances, taxes, actively interacted with priests to secure their support, especially in Upper Egypt, where respect for pharaohs and Egyptian cults traditionally remained stronger. She negotiated with governors, controlled trade revenues, managed Nile shipping, and dealt with grain supply for the country. She spoke at official ceremonies not only in Greek, but also in Egyptian, which displeased the Greek courtiers, but strengthened her position among the common people. Such striving for independence caused sharp irritation among Ptolemy the Third circle. Pothinus, Achilles, and Theodotus understood that if they didn't eliminate Cleopatra's influence now, she would soon completely subordinate all power and push them out of any participation in governance. An open campaign to discredit her began. Courtiers whispered that Cleopatra neglected Hellenic traditions, grew too close to the Egyptian populace, ignored the opinions of the Greek aristocracy, and generally behaved like an autocratic queen, contradicting the customs of co-rule. All this happened against a backdrop of a severe economic situation. Debt obligations to Roman bankers hadn't disappeared. Harvests in recent years had been poor. Bread prices rose. Discontent grew in the provinces. Cleopatra tried to stabilize the situation by reducing taxes in Upper Egypt, arranging negotiations with temples and trade guilds. But all this required time, which she didn't have. By early 50 BC, the conflict shifted from hidden struggle to an open phase. First, Cleopatra was barred from official ceremonies, then her signature disappeared from state documents. After this came an order to leave Alexandria, formally for seclusion and rest, but in essence it was exile. Cleopatra headed to Thebaid, the southern provinces of Egypt, where pharaonic power was traditionally stronger, and the population's sympathies often lay with whoever could speak their language and understood local customs. Here she began gathering an army, relying on the support of loyal governors, officials, and priests. Simultaneously, she established contact with tribal leaders from Nubia and mercenaries from Near Eastern territories. At the same time, the situation became even more complicated. Cleopatra's younger sister, Arsinoe, who had previously stayed in the shadows, began to show political activity, waiting for the opportune moment to make her own move and possibly seize power. Meanwhile, Pothinus and his supporters continued to strengthen Ptolemy's power. They understood that to achieve final victory over Cleopatra, they needed not just to hold the capital but to secure Rome's support. But precisely at this moment, Egypt became entangled in a much wider conflict, the civil war in the Roman Republic. In 49 BC, Julius Caesar, crossing the Rubicon, began military action against the senatorial coalition led by Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great. The war rapidly gained momentum, and it soon became clear its outcome would determine not only Rome's fate, but also that of many dependent states, including Egypt. After his defeat at Pharsalus, Pompey fled to Egypt, hoping to find refuge and support there. However, Pothinus, Achilles, and Theodotus, perfectly understanding Caesar had won, decided to outsmart everyone and show their loyalty to Rome. They set a trap for Pompey. As soon as he stepped off the ship, he was stabbed to death right on the shore, and his head and signet ring were sent as a gift to Julius Caesar. This act, as would soon become clear, was a fatal error. Caesar, arriving in Alexandria just days later, was shocked and enraged. For him, the murder of a Roman citizen, even an enemy, without trial and on foreign soil, looked not like a service but a brazen interference in Rome's affairs. It was from this moment that events began that would overturn not only the struggle for the Egyptian throne, but also Cleopatra's entire future destiny. When Julius Caesar landed in Egypt, his arrival marked not just another episode in Rome's civil war, but a turning point for the entire Eastern Mediterranean. Formally, he arrived pursuing his opponent Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, who had fled to Egypt after defeat at Pharsalus, hoping to find sanctuary. However, his head was presented to Caesar as a supposedly gracious gift. This act did not elicit gratitude from Caesar. On the contrary, he was deeply outraged, for despite the civil war, Pompey remained a Roman citizen and consul, a man with whom Caesar had shared years of complex relations, from alliances to rivalry. He assessed the Egyptian authorities' act as nothing less than brazen interference in Rome's affairs, in a crime that must not go unpunished. He ordered a dignified burial for Pompey, demanded the presence of all sides in the Egyptian conflict, and declared that he now took upon himself the mission to ensure the execution of the late Ptolemy III's will, a document the Roman Senate had once recognized as legally binding. Caesar, acting in Rome's name, considered it his duty to restore the co-rule and end the internecine strife engulfing the country. However, his declaration instantly provoked fierce resistance from Ptolemy III's regents. They understood that Cleopatra's return meant their inevitable downfall. Cleopatra was outside Alexandria, near the Syrian border at this moment, still gathering her army, trying to restore her position. But news of Caesar's arrival and his willingness to consider the dynastic dispute forced her to make an immediate decision to penetrate Alexandria at any cost and secure a personal meeting with the Roman dictator. Entering the city was extremely difficult. It was under the control of Ptolemy's troops, and any open approach risked arrest or death. Cleopatra then resorted to a daring plan that later became legendary. She secretly crossed by sea to Alexandria in a small boat, concealed within a bundle, according to some sources, a carpet, others, a sack for bed linen. A servant, Apollodorus of Sicily, delivered her directly to Caesar's residence. When the fabric was unrolled before the Roman general and Cleopatra stood before him, she produced an effect far stronger than any letters or negotiations could have. Young, beautiful, and self-assured, speaking in excellent Greek, she immediately got down to business. She didn't plead or beg. She laid out her position circumstantially and clearly. She spoke of her father's will, her illegal exile, the conspiracy of Pothinus, Achilles, and Theodotus, and that restoring her power was not a matter of mercy, but of justice and fulfilling legal obligations to Egypt and Rome. Caesar, a man who had lived decades in political intrigue and military campaigns, immediately appreciated her determination, intellect, and charisma. But even more, he valued the fact that an alliance with Cleopatra gave Rome direct access to the Egyptian treasury and strategically vital grain supplies, desperately needed to feed the Italian provinces. The next morning, Caesar demanded Ptolemy appear for negotiations. When the young king, about 13 years old, entered Caesar's chambers and saw Cleopatra beside him, his reaction was violent. According to Plutarch, he rushed at Caesar with shouts, tore off his diadem, and threw it on the ground in despair. Behind this emotional outburst lay the understanding that his position was threatened. Negotiations immediately deadlocked. Pothinus, Achilles, and Theodotus openly declared that Caesar had no right to interfere in Egypt's internal affairs. Caesar, in turn, stated he was acting in full accordance with Ptolemy II's will, recognized by the Roman Senate, and intended to ensure its execution. The answer was rebellion. Achilles raised Ptolemy's army and began a blockade of the palace quarter where Caesar was stationed. Pothinus organized a sharp reduction in food supplies to the port area, trying to starve the Romans into submission. The so-called Alexandrian War began. Caesar, with only about 4,000 soldiers at his disposal, fortified himself in the palace and harbor area, understanding his only chance to hold out was to control the sea. He ordered the Egyptian fleet anchored in the harbor to be destroyed to deprive the enemy of the ability to impose a naval blockade. The fire that engulfed the port spread to adjacent buildings, and, as many believe, a significant part of the storerooms and archives of the famous Library of Alexandria suffered damage then, though the exact scale of the destruction remains debated by historians. Land battles for the city raged with varying success. Ptolemy's army vastly outnumbered the Romans, but was inferior in organization and discipline. Cleopatra actively worked with local elites during this time, convincing them that her return was the key to stability and ending the war, promising protection for temple property and previous privileges. The turning point came after Caesar managed to receive reinforcements. Auxiliary troops arrived via Cilicia and Syria. Simultaneously, a rebellion erupted within the city against Pothinus, accused of conspiring against Caesar. Pothinus was arrested and executed. Achilles died in one of the battles, and the rhetorician Theodotus managed to flee, saving his life. Ptolemy, realizing his position was hopeless, tried to flee Alexandria. However, his boat capsized in the swampy Nile Delta, and he drowned. His body was found later and brought back to the city. After this, resistance was broken. Caesar restored Cleopatra to the throne, but, to observe external dynastic formalities, insisted on her formal marriage to her youngest brother, Ptolemy XIV, then about 12 years old. This union was purely nominal. Real power in Egypt now belonged entirely to Cleopatra. Thus ended one of the most dangerous and dramatic chapters in the Egyptian queen's life. However, a new stage awaited her, an alliance with mighty Rome, with Caesar himself, which would soon lead not only to the strengthening of her power, but also to the birth of an heir destined to play a special role in her fate. When the smoke of war cleared and Ptolemy XXIII's body was retrieved from the Nile waters, Cleopatra gained full power over Egypt. Formally, she ruled alongside her youngest brother, Ptolemy XIV. However, this union was purely nominal, holding no real significance for governing the country. All power now belonged to the woman who had not only survived a deadly dynastic war, but turned its outcome into a reinforcement of her legitimacy. After the Alexandrian War concluded, Caesar remained in Egypt longer than expected in Rome or at the Egyptian court. Officially, he explained his presence as necessary to restore order and resolve administrative matters, but in reality, it was evident that the reason for his stay lay elsewhere. Their alliance with Cleopatra, beginning as diplomatic cooperation, quickly became a close personal union. They spent long days together, first in Alexandria, then on a journey up the Nile, which entered history as one of the most unusual episodes in the Roman dictator's biography. The expedition along the Nile banks had several goals. On one hand, Caesar wanted to see personally the country that supplied grain to a significant part of the Roman world, known in Rome mainly through the tales of traders, diplomats, and geographers. On the other hand, Cleopatra used this voyage to demonstrate to her people the restoration of legitimate authority, showing that Egypt was once again under the rule of a strong ruler supported by the Mediterranean's most powerful state. The flotilla, consisting of dozens of ships, moved along the Nile, making stops at key religious and administrative centers, Memphis, Hermopolis, Thebes. At each stop, solemn ceremonies were held, sacrifices made to the gods, festivals organized for the people, and generous gifts bestowed upon the temples. Caesar visited Egyptian sanctuaries with interest, carefully examined the architecture, listened to the priests' stories, inquired about the land's ancient history and its religious rites. It was during this time that Cleopatra became pregnant. In the spring of 47 BC, she gave birth to a son. The boy was named Ptolemy XV Caesar, but from birth he received the unofficial nickname Caesarion, meaning Little Caesar. Although Caesar never officially acknowledged him in a legal sense, he didn't deny his paternity, and the very fact of the child's birth was perceived as an obvious symbol of the union between Egypt and Rome. After her son's birth, Cleopatra focused on restoring and strengthening Egypt. She revised the tax system destabilized by years of rebellion, improved grain collection organization, and initiated large-scale works to restore canals and irrigation systems. Special attention was paid to reviving temples, maintaining the priesthood's authority, and restoring the trust of provincial elites. The emphasis was on demonstrating that with the return of legitimate power came order, stability, and prosperity. However, Cleopatra understood perfectly that all her efforts within Egypt would be meaningless without securing a firm position in relations with Rome. Therefore, she decided to travel to Rome itself to personally cement political agreements with Caesar and secure recognition of her authority and her son's status. The journey was organized with maximum possible luxury. Cleopatra arrived in Rome with a huge entourage, including not only her closest advisors, but also representatives of Egyptian temples, officials, guards, musicians, and attendants for the infant Caesarion. Upon arrival, she settled in a luxurious villa specially built for her by Caesar outside the sacred city limits, Pomerium, on the right bank of the Tiber in the Campus Martius area. This allowed her to formally avoid legal complications, as foreign monarchs were not permitted within the sacred boundary of the city, according to Roman custom. Cleopatra's presence in Rome became an event causing colossal resonance. The Roman aristocracy viewed the Egyptian queen with suspicion, envy, and irritation. Rumors spread that Caesar intended not only to recognize Caesarion as his heir, but also to move the center of power from Rome to Alexandria. These rumors circulated through the city with frightening speed, though no factual basis existed. Particular irritation stemmed from the fact that Caesar already had a lawful wife, Calpurnia, making his open relationship with Cleopatra perceived as an outright challenge to Roman morals. The situation worsened as Caesar, not hiding his feelings, ordered a gilded statue of Cleopatra, depicted as Isis, to be placed in the temple of Venus Genetrix, the patron goddess of his Julian clan. For many Romans, this was not merely an eccentric act, but a direct violation of traditions beyond the permissible. Caesar, despite all the rumors and gossip, continued to act based on his interests. He was focused on large-scale state reforms, redistributing land, granting citizenship to provincials, creating new colonies, reorganizing the Senate while limiting its former powers. He sought to strengthen his power, formally preserving republican institutions, but effectively transforming Rome into a personal autocracy. During this time, Cleopatra observed events with great attention and caution. She met with influential senators, diplomats, and entrepreneurs, discussing trade agreements, trying not to interfere directly in Rome's affairs while simultaneously building a network of connections that could protect her interests and Egypt's. She understood that although her position seemed secure, it was entirely tied to Caesar's figure. Any change in his fate would immediately threaten her own position and her son's future. Nevertheless, she continued to strengthen her position, believing her presence in Rome was necessary to legitimize her authority, gain recognition for Caesarion, and finally transform Egypt into a stable and reliable state, capable of existing in the closest alliance with Rome. These months in Rome were for Cleopatra simultaneously a time of triumph and hidden tension. She saw conspiracies multiplying around Caesar, that among senators and the old Roman aristocracy, fear of his growing power, his reforms, and the very presence of a mighty Eastern queen in Rome, symbolizing for many not just foreign influence, but a threat to the foundations of the Republican order, was increasing. Yet despite the hidden hostility, rumors, and intrigues, Cleopatra continued to live in Rome, make plans, and hope that their union with Caesar would prove not just a temporary episode, but the foundation for a new power system where her son would have a worthy place. But fate was preparing a very different turn. On March 15, 44 BC, Rome was shaken by an event that changed not only its own destiny, but also Cleopatra's. Early that morning, Gaius Julius Caesar went to the theater of Pompey, where the Senate had gathered for a session. Despite warnings from friends, ominous omens, and his wife Calpurnia's desperate pleas to stay home, Caesar ignored the danger and arrived at the meeting, believing his status as dictator and triumphator made him untouchable by conspiracies. Inside the Curia, the Senate House, the conspirators awaited him, representatives of noble Roman families, including Marcus Junius Brutus, Gaius Cassius Longinus, and others who had called themselves his friends just the day before. They surrounded Caesar and, at a prearranged signal, stabbed him 23 times with daggers. His body collapsed at the foot of Pompey's statue, the man he had once defeated in civil war. This scene became a symbol of the end of one world and the beginning of another, far more dangerous and chaotic one. When news of Caesar's assassination reached Cleopatra, she was in her palace outside the Pomerium, on the right bank of the Tiber. Her reaction was instantaneous. Her alliance with Caesar, political and personal, collapsed in an instant. With it collapsed the entire structure she had built over many years. Most importantly, the fate of her son Caesarion, born of Caesar and destined to be her successor and dynastic heir, was now threatened. Cleopatra understood perfectly that remaining in Rome was mortally dangerous. The city was rapidly descending into chaos. Crowds oscillated between fear and fury. Senators didn't know if they could hold on to power. Rumors of impending reprisals against anyone connected with the late dictator spread through the streets. In such a situation, only one option remained: to leave Rome as quickly as possible and return to Egypt to save herself, her son, and maintain control over the state. On her orders, preparations for departure began immediately. With her son, numerous entourage, close officials, and priests, she left Rome. The journey home was tense and fraught with apprehension. She couldn't be sure that power in Rome wouldn't shift so radically that it would lead to immediate intervention in Egypt's affairs. Returning to Alexandria, Cleopatra faced a new political reality. The Senate's attempt to restore the Republican order failed almost immediately. The people did not accept Caesar's murder. Demands for vengeance echoed in the streets. The old orders were crumbling. Three figures rapidly came to the forefront. Mark Antony, Caesar's closest associate and one of the most experienced generals of his time. Octavian, Gaius Octavius Thurinus, Caesar's adopted son and heir, barely 19 years old but already showing remarkable political acumen for his age. And Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, commander of the army in the West, an influential but less independent participant in the future alliance. Understanding that Egypt couldn't remain aloof from these events, Cleopatra immediately began strengthening her internal position. Formally, her younger brother Ptolemy XIII remained co-ruler, but in 44 BC he suddenly died. Modern historians have little doubt that his death was not accidental. Cleopatra eliminated him to clear the path for her son Caesarion, who now officially received the title Ptolemy XV and was proclaimed her co-ruler. Meanwhile, the power struggle in Rome entered an open phase. The Second Triumvirate was formed, an alliance of Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus. This alliance was legally formalized, ratified, and granted nearly unlimited powers. The triumvirs had the right to pass laws without Senate approval, execute without trial, confiscate property, raise armies, and appoint governors. A wave of proscriptions, bloody lists of political enemies marked for death, began in Rome. Against this backdrop, control over the East fell to Mark Antony. He became the man in whose hands the fate of all the eastern provinces of the Roman world, including Egypt, now lay. Antony was in the city of Tarsus, where he was holding military and administrative assemblies, organizing tax collection, and demanding reports from allied states. Cleopatra received a letter demanding she immediately come to Tarsus to explain why Egypt, formerly an ally of Rome, hadn't provided sufficient support in the war against Caesar's assassins. This summons was formally couched in diplomatic language as a loyalty check, but in reality it was a challenge to a political duel. Cleopatra had to demonstrate not only her loyalty to the new Roman order, but also her personal strength, skill in negotiation, and ability to defend Egypt's interests. Cleopatra's response was swift and extraordinarily spectacular. Instead of arriving in Tarsus with a modest escort, as other vassal rulers did, she staged an arrival that became an event recorded in the annals of history. At the mouth of the river Cydnus, her flotilla appeared in full splendor. Ships with purple sails and gilded oars moved to the sound of music, and the central ship, adorned with a canopy of gold and precious fabrics, carried the queen herself, dressed in attire symbolizing her divine incarnation as the goddess Isis. Antony, famed for his passion for spectacles, pleasures, and theatrical gestures, was stunned by this appearance. Their first meeting took place not in the halls of official residences, but aboard Cleopatra's ship, where a lavish feast was held, filled with expensive wines, exquisite dishes, music, and performances. That night marked the beginning not just of diplomatic negotiations, but of an alliance that would soon alter the balance of power in the Mediterranean. Yet behind all the external theatricality lay a clear political strategy. Cleopatra understood perfectly that Egypt was in a dangerous position. Rome was too strong to fight and too greedy to ignore the wealth of the Nile. Her task was not merely to survive under these conditions, but to secure from Antony an alliance that would not only guarantee Egypt's security, but also strengthen her own power and Caesarion's position as heir. Antony, in turn, had his own reasons for forming the alliance. His military campaigns required enormous funds, supplies of food, a fleet, and gold. The eastern provinces, including Egypt, were the source of everything necessary to continue the struggle for power. Moreover, Cleopatra impressed him not only with her magnificence, but also with her skill in negotiation, deep knowledge of politics, diplomacy, and culture. After several weeks spent together in Tarsus, Antony left the affairs of governing the East to his deputies and went with Cleopatra to Alexandria. From this point on, their alliance could no longer be considered purely political. It became personal, closely intertwined with their ambitions, plans, and destinies. In Alexandria, the life of Antony and Cleopatra took the form of alternating festivals, hunts, theatrical performances, and lavish banquets they hosted for themselves and the courtiers. However, behind this external luxury, intense work continued. Connections were strengthened, agreements were concluded, and future steps were prepared that would very soon change the political map of the entire Mediterranean. After Mark Antony left Tarsus with Cleopatra and arrived in Alexandria, their alliance rapidly evolved from political partnership into a full-fledged personal and dynastic alliance that, over several years, determined the fate of a significant part of the Eastern Mediterranean. Their relationship extended far beyond diplomatic calculations, and Alexandria transformed not only into Egypt's capital, but also into the political center of the East, from which decisions affecting dozens of peoples and states emanated. Immediately after Antony's arrival in Egypt, a new period began, marked by a series of lavish festivities, theatrical performances, masquerades, and endless banquets held within the framework of the so-called Society of Inimitable Livers, Amimetobioi. This society, created on Cleopatra's initiative, included Antony, her closest advisors, trusted officers, courtiers, and intellectuals. Each day, the society's members competed in generosity, wit, and inventiveness, where luxury and extravagance became not just elements of entertainment, but part of demonstrating the might and boundless possibilities of royal power. Yet behind all this external splendor lay entirely pragmatic goals. Antony needed the resources of the East to prepare for the inevitable confrontation with Octavian, who was rapidly consolidating his power in Rome. Egypt provided Antony not only with gold, grain, and ships, but also a secure rear base beyond the reach of his Roman enemies. A crucial political step was the solemn ceremony in Alexandria, where Antony and Cleopatra officially proclaimed the division of spheres of influence. Antony himself received the title King of Kings, and Cleopatra Queen of Kings. This ceremony, later interpreted by Roman historians as a marriage, though it held no legal force in Roman law, was essentially not just an affirmation of their personal union, but a declaration of a new political model of Eastern monarchy intended to counter the Roman center of power. At this same ceremony, Antony solemnly bestowed titles and formal domains upon their joint children. Their son Alexander Helios received the title King of Armenia, Media, and Parthian territory, which Antony had yet to conquer. The twins Cleopatra Selene and Alexander Helios, born in 40 BC, and a few years later their third son, Ptolemy Philadelphus, born 36 BC, were formally granted rule over Phoenicia, Syria, and part of Arabia. Of course, the actual borders of these domains remained largely nominal, but the political message was absolutely unambiguous. Antony and Cleopatra were building an alternative Eastern empire capable of rivaling Octavian's power. The culmination of this demonstrative redistribution of power was the ceremony known as the Donations of Alexandria. During it, before tens of thousands of citizens, Antony and Cleopatra, seated on golden thrones, announced a list of new titles, lands, and rights for their children. Cleopatra was proclaimed Queen of Kings not only of Egypt but also of Cyprus, Libya, Syria, and part of Asia Minor. Each child received their share of the symbolic inheritance. In Alexandria, the public greeted these decisions with jubilation. Egyptian priesthood supported the new model of power, reviving the tradition of the pharaonic monarchy, where the ruler was perceived as the earthly embodiment of divine order. However, in Rome, all this caused an unprecedented wave of outrage and horror. Octavian's propaganda machine immediately launched a campaign to vilify Antony and Cleopatra. The Senate and people were told that Antony had lost the honor of a Roman citizen, become a slave to an Eastern queen, and intended to move the center of power from Rome to Alexandria. Rumors about an allegedly existing will of Antony had a particularly powerful effect. According to Octavian's assertions, it transferred parts of Roman territories to his children by Cleopatra and expressed a desire to be buried in Alexandria beside the queen. How genuine this will was remains debated to this day. Regardless, its publication became a brilliant instrument of political warfare. The Roman public perceived these news items as treason, and the Senate finally withdrew its trust from Antony, stripped him of all official powers, and declared him an enemy of the state. Meanwhile, Octavian continued methodically strengthening his position. His control over Italy, Spain, Gaul, North Africa, and the western Mediterranean provinces was absolute. He had the support of the Senate, army legates, and the overwhelming majority of Rome's population, swayed by his powerful propaganda. Antony and Cleopatra, realizing war was unavoidable, began large-scale mobilization. In Egypt and their subject territories, population censuses were conducted, tax revenues assessed, and stocks of food, weapons, and raw materials rechecked. A fleet was intensively built. New ships were purchased, mercenaries hired, siege engines and war machines acquired. Soldiers were brought to Alexandria from Syria, Judea, Cilicia, Armenia, and Arab tribes. Supply agreements were concluded with states of the East. But despite numerical superiority in ships, Antony and Cleopatra's resources were already beginning to fall short of Octavian's capabilities. His army was more disciplined, better equipped, and had experienced commanders. Octavian's fleet was more organized and compact, a decisive factor in the impending sea battle. Meanwhile, Antony's diplomatic contacts with the Roman Senate ceased entirely. A last attempt to negotiate ended in failure. The Senate not only refused to recognize the legitimacy of any of Antony's decisions, but also officially declared war on Cleopatra as Queen of Egypt, deliberately phrasing it this way to emphasize that the enemy was not the Roman citizen Antony, but a foreign monarchy threatening Rome. By the beginning of 32 BC, both sides were rapidly preparing for the inevitable war, understanding that the outcome of this confrontation would determine not only the personal fate of Antony and Cleopatra, but also the fate of the entire Mediterranean world. By the summer of 31st BC, the confrontation between East and West, between Mark Antony and Cleopatra on one side and Octavian on the other, entered its decisive phase, with no room left for diplomatic maneuvers or hopes of compromise. The sides understood that only war lay ahead, which would determine the fate of the entire Mediterranean world. The main forces of Antony and Cleopatra concentrated at the strategically vital port of Actium, located at the entrance to the Ambracian Gulf on the western coast of Greece. A huge camp was deployed here with fortifications, ditches, defensive towers, and supply systems that, however, became less reliable by the day. The main reliance was on the fleet, over 200 heavy ships, many of which were multi-deck giants with powerful metal-sheathed rams, towers for archers, and catapults on their decks. Cleopatra's fleet formed a separate part of this force. The Egyptian squadron was stationed in the rear, closer to the open sea exit. These ships were lighter, faster, and more maneuverable than Antony's, making them more suitable for carrying orders, reconnaissance, and, if necessary, a quick retreat than for direct combat. Octavian entrusted command of his fleet to his chief strategist and friend, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, a man possessing exceptional talent for naval operations. Octavian's fleet was smaller in terms of ships, but significantly more mobile. Its main advantage lay not in frontal assault, but in the ability to outflank, blockade, scatter, and wear down the enemy. Agrippa's first moves proved decisive. He quickly captured key coastal cities on the western coast of Greece, cutting off supply routes to Antony's army and gaining control of sea communications. This meant food and reinforcements stopped reaching Antony's camp, and his army's situation deteriorated day by day. Hunger, disease, and desertion began to undermine its strength as effectively as any battle. Tension grew within Antony's camp. Some commanders demanded an immediate land battle where Antony's experienced legions could compensate for the fleet's problems. However, Cleopatra, relying on her admiral's calculations, insisted on breaking the naval blockade and retreating to Egypt, where she still had resources to continue the war and the possibility to rebuild strength. Sources unanimously note that meetings in Antony's headquarters became increasingly difficult and conflict-ridden. Discontent grew in the camp. Rumors of possible betrayal spread, and defectors crossed over to Octavian daily, carrying information about the situation inside the camp, the fleet's condition, and command plans. The battle began on the morning of September 231st BC. The weather that day favored Octavian's lighter ships. A steady wind from the sea and weak currents played to his advantage. Antony lined up his fleet in a crescent formation at the entrance to the Ambracian Gulf, trying to block the entrance and force Octavian to attack head-on, where the powerful rams of his ships could give him an advantage. But Agrippa refused a frontal assault. He began with flanking maneuvers, trying to split the formation of Antony's heavy ships and isolate them from each other. The main weapons of Octavian's fleet, boarding hooks, assault bridges, and light catapults, allowed them to quickly capture and blockade the enemy's massive vessels, which due to their size were unwieldy and slow to react to rapid changes in the battle. The battle quickly turned into a series of disjointed skirmishes. Octavian's maneuverable ships attacked from the sides, surrounded individual heavy ships of Antony's fleet, rained down volleys of arrows and firebrands, and then captured the decks with boarding parties. At some point, Antony, seeing the battle turning into a protracted, exhausting struggle where his ships were gradually losing combat capability, began preparing for the pre-planned maneuver of withdrawal. When Cleopatra raised signal sails on her ship, her squadron turned and moved toward the open sea. Whether this was part of the initial plan or a moment of panic remains debated by ancient authors. But it is known for certain that Antony, seeing Cleopatra's ships withdrawing, immediately abandoned command of the fleet, left the battle on his fast ship, and followed her, leaving the rest of the fleet and the land army to their fate. After their flight, the battle was effectively lost. The ships still in formation began to surrender chaotically. Some tried to break south but were destroyed or captured. Others were trapped and gradually annihilated. Antony's infantry, remaining in the fortified camp on shore, initially tried to organize resistance, but, learning of the commander's flight and the fleet's loss, began defecting en masse to Octavian's side. Antony and Cleopatra sailed first south to the Peloponnese coast, then along the coast of Cyprus, avoiding Roman patrols. Finally, after several weeks, they reached Alexandria. There they were met with a grim and tense silence. News of the Actium catastrophe had arrived before them. The whole city knew Rome was celebrating victory. In Alexandria, final attempts to salvage the situation began. Cleopatra sent a delegation to Octavian proposing peace. She was willing to renounce Antony, surrender the entire Egyptian treasury, and recognize Rome's supremacy if she were allowed to keep the crown and independence for her children. Antony, learning of this, flew into a rage, but as subsequent events showed, within days himself began offering to surrender to Octavian and retire into private exile. Octavian rejected all proposals. For him, there was no alternative but the complete destruction of Antony's and Cleopatra's power. Egypt was to become part of the Roman state, and the history of the Ptolemaic dynasty would end with the life of its last queen. The finale was now inevitable. When Mark Antony and Cleopatra returned to Alexandria after the catastrophic defeat at Actium, they held no illusions that the situation could be salvaged militarily. Egypt stood completely alone before the relentlessly advancing Roman war machine. The fleet was destroyed, the army demoralized, allies scattered or defected to Octavian, and Rome celebrated victory while preparing to deliver the final blow. From the autumn of 31st BC, Octavian began methodical preparations for the final invasion of Egypt. His army, significantly reinforced by ships and legions gathered in the eastern provinces, moved slowly but surely southward, securing key coastal cities, intercepting trade routes, and severing Egypt's last diplomatic ties with the outside world. Along the way, he concluded agreements with the rulers of Judea, Syria, and Cilicia, ensuring a secure rear and uninterrupted supply for his army. Cleopatra continued desperately seeking an escape. Negotiations with Octavian proceeded through various envoys and intermediaries, but her proposals boiled down to one: surrender Egypt's entire fleet, treasury, and garrisons to Rome in exchange for keeping the throne for herself and safety for her children. Octavian, feigning willingness to negotiate, skillfully stalled for time, understanding that every delay only strengthened his position and weakened moral and military resistance in Alexandria. Meanwhile, Antony sank into despair. Having lost his army, fleet, and support, he increasingly withdrew from affairs, avoided public appearances, spent time in his private quarters, alternating dark brooding with banquets that grew more desperate and joyless by the day. By the spring of 30 BC, Octavian's troops crossed into Egypt. Garrisons left to guard roads and key points either surrendered without a fight or offered negligible resistance. By July, the army approached the walls of Alexandria. Skirmishes and local battles flared on the city's outskirts. But no one doubted this was the death throes. The question was only one of time. During these days, an event occurred that remains one of the most famous and tragic scenes of ancient history. Antony received word that Cleopatra had killed herself. Sources differ on how this information appeared. According to one version, Cleopatra's attendants spread the false news, trying to spur Antony to decisive action. According to another, Cleopatra herself, no longer hoping for joint salvation, deliberately orchestrated this disinformation, calculating that news of her death, or even the rumor of it, would prompt Antony to kill himself, giving her a chance to negotiate with Octavian by offering surrender without resistance. Be that as it may, hearing of her supposed death, Antony made a decision long brewing within him. He ordered his slave Eros to stab him, but Eros, unable to do it, killed himself instead. Then Antony, gathering his last strength, drove his sword into his own stomach. However, the wound was not immediately fatal. He lost consciousness, bleeding profusely, but remained alive. At that moment, a servant brought word that Cleopatra was alive and in her chambers, locked in one of the palace towers. The half-dead Antony was carried there. Tradition holds he was hoisted through a window, as the palace entrances were already controlled by Roman soldiers. Their final meeting occurred surrounded by the few remaining servants. Antony, bleeding, managed to say a few words to her. He begged her not to trust Octavian, to save the children's lives and, if possible, her own. He died in her arms. After his death, Cleopatra negotiated for several more days with Octavian, hoping to persuade him to spare her life and crown, or at least ensure the children's safety. Octavian, as before, behaved politely and restrainedly, promising to consider her requests but constantly setting new conditions, demanding the surrender of the treasury, garrisons, and her personal capitulation. Rumors began reaching Cleopatra that Octavian had no intention of negotiating with her as an equal, that she faced not a peace treaty, but the shame of participating in a triumph in Rome, shackled in golden chains, paraded before the crowd as the victor's trophy. It was then she understood that the only way to preserve her dignity was death. On August 12th, 30th BC, Julian calendar, August 29th by our reckoning, Cleopatra, under guard in her own chambers, ordered a basket of figs to be brought. According to one version, a venomous cobra, a symbol of Egyptian royalty, was hidden in this basket. According to another, it was a potent poison concealed in a hairpin or a jar of ointment. Her servants carried out her will. She lay down on a couch clad in royal robes and took the poison. Her maidservants, Iris and Charmian, remained with her until the end. Tradition says that when Roman soldiers forced open the doors, they found Cleopatra dead, and her maidservants, still alive, were arranging her robes and hair so that even death would not mar her dignity. Octavian, arriving soon after, ordered Cleopatra buried beside Mark Antony, fulfilling her last wish. Perhaps this gesture was motivated less by mercy than by a desire to demonstrate to the Roman people his power over the fates of kings and queens. Immediately afterward, Octavian declared Egypt his personal property, not merely a province but a territory governed directly by the emperor and his prefects. All Egypt's wealth, gold, grain, papyrus, craftsmen's goods, and port revenues, from that moment flowed directly into the imperial treasury. Thus ended the history of the Ptolemaic dynasty, which had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, since Ptolemy Soter, one of Alexander the Great's closest companions, founded it after the partition of Alexander's empire. With its end, the era of Hellenistic kingdoms also concluded, a time when East and West could still exist as equal civilizations. From that moment, the entire Mediterranean world came under the rule of one center, Rome. When the walls of Alexandria fell silent, when the last Ptolemy ceased to exist, and the banners of the Roman eagles were raised over Egypt, a new period began. A time when Cleopatra's story ceased to be merely the biography of a queen and transformed into a legend that would live for centuries, changing forms, meanings, and images. After her death, the fate of her children became one of the first questions Octavian addressed. Caesarion was immediately declared a threat to the new order. It was too dangerous to leave alive a child who had the birthright to claim not only the Egyptian throne, but also, by the logic of ancient politics, the throne of Rome if he could unite forces hostile to Octavian. On Octavian's orders, Caesarion was captured while trying to flee south to Nubia and executed. He was only 17 years old. Cleopatra's Children by Mark Antony, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus were captured alive and sent to Rome. There they appeared in Octavian's triumphal procession, dressed in Eastern garments with golden chains, symbolizing not so much their guilt as the defeat of their parents and the entire East. After the triumph, Octavian did not execute them. They were too young and posed no immediate threat. The children came under the protection of Octavia, Octavian's sister and the former wife of Mark Antony. Octavia raised them as her own, ensuring them a respectable position in Roman society. Of all Cleopatra and Antony's children, only Cleopatra Selene lived to adulthood. She married Jubasu, the king of Mauritania, an educated and Rome-loyal ruler who had been raised at the Roman court. Together with him, she ruled Mauritania, making it one of the most prosperous and Hellenized states in the Roman world. Her descendants continued to rule in North Africa for several more generations, leaving their mark on history as Roman client kings, semi-independent but formally dependent rulers. Cleopatra's own story soon began to turn into myth. Already in the Roman era, two parallel narratives formed around her image. The first, official and created by the victors, Octavian's propaganda, depicted Cleopatra as a seductress whose charms clouded Mark Antony's mind, as the embodiment of the dangerous East threatening Rome's stern morality and order. The second line, less official but equally influential, preserved Cleopatra's image as a woman possessing outstanding intellect, political talent, education, and the ability to play on equal terms with the era's most powerful men. Over the centuries, the mythology surrounding her personality only intensified. Ancient authors like Plutarch, Cassius Dio, and Appian described her appearance, character, and habits differently. Some insisted her beauty was dazzling. Others wrote that her appeal lay not so much in her looks as in her wit, manner of speaking, refined manners, subtle humor, and ability to charm interlocutors regardless of their status or intentions. Medieval Europe largely forgot Cleopatra, but with the Renaissance her image began to return, first in Latin chronicles, then in the works of artists and playwrights. Her story inspired William Shakespeare, who wrote the tragedy Antony and Cleopatra, where the personal drama of two lovers was intertwined with the history of falling kingdoms and changing eras. In the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, Cleopatra became the heroine of dozens of operas, paintings, and literary works, where her image was definitively transformed into a symbol of female power, passion, beauty, and simultaneously fatal danger. In the 19th century, fueled by fascination with the Orient and Egyptology, her name resurfaced in artistic culture. Cleopatra appeared on canvases by Jean-Léon Gérôme and Lawrence Alma Tadema, in sculpture and architecture, becoming the heroine of historical novels and theatrical productions. She was depicted as an exotic queen surrounded by gold and marble, and as a tragic woman perishing in the struggle against ruthless history. In the 20th century, her image became firmly embedded in popular culture. Films, including the famous Hollywood epic with Elizabeth Taylor, made her a globally recognizable symbol, simultaneously a powerful queen, a femme fatale, a politician, a lover, a myth, and a legend. However, historians continue to unravel the real Cleopatra behind this layer of artistic interpretations, examining documents, coins, inscriptions, and literary sources, attempting to reconstruct the woman behind all these masks. Today, Cleopatra's name remains one of the most recognizable on the planet. It has become synonymous not only with power, but also with the ability to defy circumstances and play on equal terms in a world where the rules were written by men. Her story is not only a tale of the fall of the last Egyptian queen, it is the chronicle of the end of an entire era, where East and West could still look upon each other with equal dignity. Thus ended the life of the last queen of Egypt. But her eternity in history began.